54 billion on the low side is the estimate, up to 108 billion on the high side, for what was ultimately being laundered through Ukraine. We saw the desperate attempts from everybody from Lindsey Graham all the way over to the Prime Minister in England and the other globalists, right? Everybody, basically the attendee list at the World Economic Forum, were all on the take. The Murdoch family is using both sides of its newspaper to continue the war with Russia. That's not the behavior of a news organization. It's the hallmark of an intel agency.
Well, this is an extraordinary development, and it's only just emerged in the last few minutes. But since this morning, when anti-corruption officials raided the home of Andriy Yermak, there has been an expectation of some kind of movement on this. How can the president's right-hand man, his chief of staff, be touched in whatever way by this corruption probe that has dominated headlines here in Ukraine for the last few weeks?
So again, what you're seeing is breaking news from the BBC coming out of Ukraine, where it is now obvious to all that are paying attention, including the media outlets, that money laundering at the largest scales and the most egregious examples has been occurring over years in the Ukraine. We've all known this. This has been nothing new. And Biden knew this, and this is nothing new. So when he was taking our taxpayer money and sending over 100 million here, 100 million there, we all knew that without true financial auditing, this was all going to be laundered into the globalists and to the corrupt that are not only leading Ukraine, but are responsible for the continuation of the war in Ukraine. That this was never about Ukraine winning and reclaiming land, because they were incapable of doing that. This was about continuing the money laundering operation. And now we have the right-hand man of Zelensky being probed by, and you know it's bad when Ukraine's money laundering investigators are involved, because they've seen everything. It has to, take quite a lot to get onto their radar, and that's assuming that they're not on the take either. So Zelensky's right-hand man is now in the possession of the authorities, and they've investigated and raided his house, getting some files and other items.
Without President Zelensky taking some kind of step, in the end, the president didn't have to. He has actually released his nightly video in which he revealed that Andriy Yermak has submitted his resignation. There's no suggestion of wrongdoing yet in terms of allegations directly towards him, but clearly this does not look good, having anti-corruption officials at his home. Yermak earlier in the day said that he was cooperating fully with the investigation. There was no comment on exactly what the investigators were searching for at his property, but this all comes on the back of Ukraine's two main anti-corruption agencies launching an investigation into a plot linked to the State Atomic Energy Agency about contracts worth $100 million through kickbacks and laundered money. You've already had...
So this is important, right? This is astronomical amounts of money laundering that was taking place. And in this instance, this is just one person. That other generals that answer to Zelensky have already fled the country and have already offshored their money. There's no doubt that Zelensky has been offshoring and laundering money for years. So he stuffed his Swiss bank accounts. The question really that is just holding back the signature on the peace deal is, where is Zelensky going to go when this is all done in the dark of night? That list is being shortened as we speak, and it's the obvious candidates of the globalist countries that were responsible for this. So start to think Western European countries is where he's going to flee to. But in this instance, this is, again, it's an important point for all of us, not because we didn't know it was happening. Of course, anybody paying attention knew. It's important because this is showing us that we're coming up to the final steps, the last gasps of air from the globalists that are attempting to subvert Trump's peace plan. But ultimately, here that the Ukrainian officials that were in on the take are just finishing up their last bit of money laundering business before they ultimately agree to peace.
The senior businessman who's also a friend of the president, who's actually fled the country. He's alleged to be the ringleader of this plot. You've had the resignation of two other ministers too, and now the most significant event of all, Andriy Yermak going. And just to remind people of who this person is, he is widely regarded. He is seen as the second most powerful person in this country. Ever since Russia's full-scale invasion, he has been at the side of the president. He is the man who has been leading negotiations with the Americans around all these sort of attempts at peace talks with Russia. We saw him just last week in Geneva, where he was leading the Ukrainian delegation there with the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio.
So again, it's not a coincidence why this gentleman, who is again the point person for the peace talks, is being targeted. The globalists are doing everything they can to be able to stop the progression of Trump's plan, and they're taking out the person that was really at the top of the pyramid, because Zelensky's not ultimately going to get involved or show his face on the peace plan until it's time for the signature. So he sent this gentleman in his place. So now, boom, big surprise. This guy is, being targeted by the authorities, and we knew that he was doing it. That's not the surprise. The surprise is just how desperate the globalists are in trying to get now another kink in this plan of trying to get forward momentum for peace in Ukraine. So just how bad, though, has the take been? In this clip, Steve Hanke, who's an economist, is going to walk us through just the general take, because, again, there hasn't been even financial auditing at all, even though the Republican side has been requesting this for any additional Ukrainian funds to make sure that everything's audited so that we know it all goes in the right places. But in this instance, Steve Hanke talks to us about how much he thinks has actually been truly laundered over the last 5 years or so in Ukraine.
If we look at the total amount of money that's been pumped into Ukraine since 2022, it's about $360 billion. And
again, it's critical that you see how bad this problem is. $360 billion has been sent, and this is the added number with European contributions as well. So it's not just U.S. The U.S. number is large because Joe Biden just never missed an opportunity to send money to the Ukraine. But $360 billion. And again, I'm not making the case that all of this was laundered. I'm making the case that the denominator in what was laundered, being the numerator, is massive. This is a tremendous amount of money that was being siphoned and funneled through Ukraine.
Out of that, I estimate that the corruption's running somewhere between 15 and 30% of that. Probably towards the 30% line. That's what the auditors found with the involvement of the United States in Afghanistan. The corruption was running at 30% in Afghanistan. I think it's probably pretty close to that in Ukraine. So we're talking, Mike, about big bucks. We've got at 15% the corruption money lining the pockets of the corrupt, $54 billion. And at 30%, it would be $108 billion.
So again, we're talking the lieutenant or assistant for Zelensky is just in this instance specifically accused of being on the take for $100 million. $54 billion on the low side is the estimate, up to $108 billion on the high side. For what was ultimately being laundered through Ukraine. That's a tremendous amount of money, and that's exactly why we saw the desperate attempts from everybody from Lindsey Graham all the way over to the Prime Minister in England and the other globalists, right? Everybody, basically the attendee list at the World Economic Forum, were all on the take. So the rich got richer in this instance, and the corrupt got more corrupt. And when we're looking at 54 billion on the low side of estimates, it's egregious. That's just all there is to it. Are we ever going to get the real number? Probably not. But again, this is going to give us a direction to go in and a direction worth exploring. Now, I'm going to finish this clip, though, with an expose, because if you were paying attention to some of these Ukraine events, Tucker Carlson sent out a tweet or an X post earlier in the week. And I want to read this to you because this leaves us not only with an acknowledgement of the money laundering, but now the question is who knew, when did they know, and why didn't they do anything about it with the laundering? So, Tucker's post. For months, the Wall Street Journal has held a story detailing the personal corruption of Andrei Yermak. That's the gentleman that you just saw in this news clip, the second most powerful man in Ukraine. Yermak has skimmed hundreds of millions in American tax dollars meant for Ukrainian aid. The Wall Street Journal, again, this is critical, an American newspaper owned by the Murdochs, their editors can prove that, but they're not. Instead, they're protecting Yermak, and this leads to the question of why. Well, according to Tucker, that's because Yermak is leading Ukraine's efforts to scuttle the Trump peace plan. So again, he was picked by Zelensky to meet with Rubio to not agree to anything, to delay, and ultimately to scuttle the peace plan for Eastern Europe. The owners of the Wall Street Journal do not want peace in Russia. They want war. At the same time, the journal's editorial page has attacked the Trump administration for trying to push for peace. So again, I'm going to pause for a minute on Tucker's post. If you were watching the cadence of stories and hit pieces against the Trump administration from Rubio to Witkoff, and the recent leaks, actually, of some of these confidential phone calls to Putin and the Ukraine officials on the peace talks, that it's mind-blowing why anybody would be against peace. Why would you be against peace? Well, the Wall Street Journal clearly is, and in this instance, they were very aware of all of the details that are just now coming to light, and they sat on the story. Propaganda at its best. So continuing with Tucker's post, this is true corruption. Without informing its readers, the Murdoch family is using both sides of its newspaper to continue the war with Russia. That's not the behavior of a news organization. It's the hallmark of an intel agency. Tucker's exactly right. And leading the charge all along has been Donald Trump in saying he has to get peace to this part of the world. And the globalists were fighting it the whole way. And we all were thinking, that's very strange. Why would anybody ever be against peace? We don't want more civilians killed. This looks like it's a stymie, right? That there's really no more geography that's being taken by Putin. Let's get to the table, get peace. Well, the scale of the money laundering is now coming to light, and the intentionality of the continuance of the war, in this case, according to Tucker, by the Murdoch family, is really appalling. It's un-American. I mean, they're not Americans anyways, right? We all know that. But it's un-American for an American journal like the Wall Street Journal to be sitting on stories that are affecting this amount of aid and this amount of lives that are at stake. So I'm curious, what do you think about this breaking news? Is this a surprise to you that Zelensky's right-hand man is now under a corruption scheme? The bigger question that I want to hear from you in the comments is, where does this go from here? Is this going to be a misstep and actually a backward step in losing momentum for Trump and Rubio's peace plan between Russia and Ukraine? Or is this going to ultimately be just another predictable milestone as we uncover everything that the deep state, that the globalists, that the WEF, and ultimately that Zelensky and his henchmen were up to?